Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. I'm back from Easter. I hope you had a lovely break with your friends and family. I certainly did. I was in Perth. Beautiful weather, beautiful state. Let's get into it today, though. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. The mess of Australia's billion-dollar inland rail project. Now, it had a worthy aim to get freight moving faster and those big trucks off country roads, but it's blown out by billions. It mightn't actually ever get finished under Labor. The bloke who set it up is angry. Regional Australia, he says, has been done over yet again. That bloke, Barnaby Joyce, a little later in the show. A huge fight has broken out in Victoria that's got Labor battling to keep secret a raft of documents from the Daniel Andrews era. We'll speak to the man in charge of that fight, David Davis, for the latest. Plus, the frightening new hate crime laws that have come into effect in Scotland that will more likely police what people can say when it comes to women's spaces and biology, rather than stamping out hate. We'll cross the UK for the latest with the brilliant pro-women activist, Helen Joyce. That shocking look from the Prime Minister, those two planes to one event, it is indulgent. And those excuses today from Chris Bowen, they are a long way from the truth. Now, I know how the system works in relation to these VIP aircrafts. I'll tell you how much you've been ripped off in a moment. And those continuing bad polls for Labor have now got ministers caught on the hop as rumbles inside the government about those so-called emergency migration laws get louder.
I don't think it's any surprise that, the Scrutiny of Bills Committee has come up with some recommendations. Well, we'll deal with that.
But first, when the PM and his climate crusader Chris Bowen went to the Hunter Valley last week, they wanted the focus to be on the government's billion-dollar handout for manufacturing solar panels here in Australia, possibly on the side of the decommissioned Liddell coal-fired power station. Now, the idea that a one-off taxpayer handout, even as generous as that, would somehow change the economics of manufacturing in Australia, that this government's subservience to the unions and their emissions obsessions have done so much to damage, well, that's deeply implausible and runs counter to repeated experience, particularly given the Prime Minister had just dropped trade action against cheap Chinese imports of wind turbines, which are about to come flooding back in. So this Hunter Valley announcement didn't generate the scepticism it deserved. But the visits now hit the headlines well and truly, not because of the $1 billion in potential waste, but because of the actual waste. $100,000 plus for two politicians to take two VIP jets in and out of Canberra to the same event. Two separate planes, two separate crews, two separate entourages for the one government and the one government announcement. Now, it is nuts, especially with the added hypocrisy of all the emissions involved for an announcement about reducing emissions.
Considering they're going to a solar announcement that's all about reducing emissions, I certainly hope they were at least offsetting the emissions of those two jets with companies, like Greenfleet and other places like that, where you can offset the emissions of your travel. So I certainly hope, and I call on the Minister for Climate Change to do that.
Now, I am not saying the Prime Minister should not have gone to Liddell to make this announcement once it became government policy. But the idea that the PM and his minister needed two planes because one 14-seater Falcon jet couldn't handle the travelling party, well, that's absurd. And as for blaming the Air Force for the decision to use two jets, well, that's just dishonest.
The Prime Minister has a large jet available to him. That would normally be what we take. The runway at Scone wasn't strong enough to take the large jet, so the Air Force recommended and took the decision for two small jets.
It was impossible for you to go together in the one plane.
Even the small jets weren't fully laden because of the weight restrictions on the. Even if we had, with the Prime Minister's security detail and other people involved, going from, as you'd imagine, the Prime Ministerial visit, two cabinet ministers, we limited the number of staff, and even then, that was the Air Force advice, the most efficient way of getting us there.
That's utter BS. I know how these trips work. VIP jets, Air Force jets, They are booked through the Defence Minister's office. The RAF Squadron, they actually have a dedicated staffer in the Minister's office to handle bookings on behalf of every minister in the government. And they're in contact with the Prime Minister's office every day, throughout the day, sometimes hourly. Now, normally, if a minister is to be involved in a prime ministerial announcement, either the minister makes his or her own way there on a commercial carrier like Qantas, or they get on board the PM's plane. Now, to get his own plane, the Climate Change Minister must have separately applied to the Defence Minister's office to take a VIP, and the Prime Minister's office, which, as I said, is always informed about the use of these Air Force jets ministers put a bid in for, well, they must have approved it. Indeed, speaking to people today, they confirmed to me that the rules I worked under in the Prime Minister's office are exactly the same as the current government, and that Mr Albanese takes a very close and personal interest in who uses these planes. So trying to blame a political decision to take 2 aircraft on the Air Force is low, and it's wrong. It's another sign that the Prime Minister's office is asleep at the wheel on these issues, that ultimately can only really be managed by them. Just like the follow-up on that immigration detainee disaster, this is basic politics 101, and the Albanese government is failing at it. Now, I get they couldn't take the big jet the PM usually flies because the runway was too short and can't carry the load at Scone, hence the need for the smaller jet. Nothing wrong there. The madness is that no one said, cut back the entourage. Take just the staff you must take. So the PM security detail, 1 or 2 essential media staff, a policy expert in case there were tricky questions the PM might have had on the detail before he was briefed ahead of the announcement. Now, all of that, plus Bowen and the Prime Minister, could easily have kept it well under 14 people. It's not as if they were travelling with luggage. I mean, this was a day trip. They could have all gone on one jet. Only it didn't happen, did it? So the taxpayer ends up being hit with a $100,000 bill for 2 planes to Scone, and the PM wants you to believe that he cares about cost of living pain and lowering emissions. Well, wrong on both fronts. Either the PM really can't stand being in the same space as the Climate Change Minister, who's doing so much damage to his government, or this is a government that's become so indulgent, so entitled, that ministers use VIP jets like taxis and have retinues like Arab princes. I mean, let's not forget Richard Marles spent nearly $3 million on Air Force jets himself last year. Either way, it's a terrible look. In politics, it's not the big things that bring you down, but the small things that ordinary people can understand. Voters often glaze over things when governments spend billions and billions, but when politicians waste money on indulgent frolics, they get that, especially with a Prime Minister who looks like he's there for the trappings of office rather than the hard work that should go with it. Well, we now know, don't we? Last year's Voice, that Yes campaign spend, well, it's bigger than the No campaign, 3-1. Yet the crushing loss was there against the Yes vote, 60-40 to No. Figures released today by the Australian Electoral Commission show that the official Yes campaign spent almost $50 million compared with about $15 million from the official No campaign. And look at the gargantuan amounts spent by woke charities and woke public companies that had no business at all funding a highly contentious political campaign that most of their staff and most of their customers and donors would clearly have been against, because that's how Australians voted, against the Voice. Here are the biggest Yes donors. The ANZ Bank, $2.5 million. Woodside, over $2 million. The Commonwealth Bank, Westpac, BHP and Rio, $2 million each. Woolies, $1.5 million. Now, what did any of this have to do with maximising returns to shareholders or delivering a better product to customers or supporting staff? Incredibly, the Paul Ramsay Foundation made the largest single donation to the Yes campaign, perhaps the largest ever political donation in Australia, an astonishing $7 million. Now, I had the honour of knowing Paul Ramsay. I know he wanted his legacy to be the Ramsay Centre for Western civilisation, not donating to political campaigns to entrench Aboriginal separatism. But what does this tell us about people running large public companies in this country? How do they so misjudge the public mood? First, the boardrooms and executive suites are out of touch with customers and staff. And second, that people running public companies, or at least these ones, are not nearly as smart as they think they are. Only one of those CEOs, former Woolies boss Brad Banducci, has paid any price for his error. Now, he's going. You can already see Woolies is going out of its way to try and win back customers after the Voice debacle and the Australia Day mess. Well, they haven't won me back. I won't shop at Woolies. And I know lots of you won't shop there either. And that's the most powerful thing we can do. Give woke corporates a hit in the hip pocket and vote the woke politicians out of office. All right, let's go to Canberra now for the headlines. On standby, Sky News political reporter Cam Rennan.
Good evening. The Prime Minister is demanding full accountability for the death of an Australian aid worker killed by an airstrike in Gaza.
Hey, this is Zomi and Chef Olivier. We're at the Jirabala kitchen.
43-year-old Zomi Frankham was helping deliver food and aid supplies when her convoy was hit by an apparent Israeli airstrike.
This is a human tragedy that should never have occurred, that is completely unacceptable.
Zomi's Australian passport found among the rubble. In search of answers, the Department of Foreign Affairs has summoned Israel's ambassador to explain what occurred, Israel's Defence Force launching its own internal investigation.
Australia expects full accountability for the deaths of aid workers.
The government has downplayed internal pushback over its failed attempt to ram through new detainee laws. Labor Senators Raf Kachoni, Tony Sheldon and Jess Walsh raised concerns in a committee report scrutinising the proposed legislation.
It is not unusual to have Senate committee reports that might differ from, how the government tries to get legislation through the parliament.
The bipartisan committee warns against using mandatory minimum sentences for detainees who refuse to cooperate with efforts to deport them.
The government's position remains unchanged.
Politicians who misbehave at work could have their pay docked or be suspended under a proposed new penalty regime. A commission charged with reprimanding MPs for bad behaviour is due to open later this year. Under draft laws, members who breach their code of conduct could lose up to 5% of their annual salary.
This is the final kind of piece of the puzzle in making sure we've got all the systems in place to make sure people are held to account for their behaviour.
It is an ever-evolving process, so I think that we should always strive to do better.
Now, we've got our reporter Carolyn Marcus at the Federal Court for Network 10's application to present new evidence in its bid to reopen the Bruce Lerman defamation trial. The verdict, you'll recall, was set to be brought down on Thursday, so this is a significant development. Carolyn's on standby. We'll bring you any update as soon as it breaks. But still, plenty else happening, isn't there? Let's bring in Sky News political editor Andrew Clennell. Those news poll numbers that were out yesterday, Andrew, interestingly, younger voters, typically voting Labor, moving away, looking at the coalition. So too is WA. Now, you've made the point before. It's a case they've got to hold everything they've got to survive. They had some really big gains in Western Australia. I've just been there on the weekend. I don't get the mood that they're happy with the government. So this will be a challenge for them, I think.
Yeah, it'll be a big challenge. And I think if you looked at where the polls are at, Labor would still retain office, but they'd probably have about 72 seats. So they'd probably lose about 6 seats, and that you could lose a couple or even 3 in WA. So you can see where that is. That's not enough for the coalition to get into power, however. And it's all really down to that campaign. It's close enough a contest that that is the case. Perhaps Peter Dutton can take a leaf out of Anthony Albanese's book and kick with the wind in the last quarter, Peter.
Yeah, we've talked, you and I, about that they need some economic upside, right? They need to really hit the households with cost of living relief. Biggest of that obviously is mortgages. One of the stats out today to say is property prices are still skyrocketing, particularly on the eastern seaboard, which means that the RBA is less likely to start cutting rates. They won't increase them, but the talk was middle of the year. Now they're saying towards the end of the year. Some are even saying into next year before we see some rate relief, if it happens, if this hot market sort of cools down a bit. But that's also what the government needs. They need a bit of luck.
Spot on. And they've been anticipating some luck, and sometimes you've got to make your own luck, because that is a dangerous assumption that everything will be hunky-dory in a year's time when you want to go to an election. And there's one big thing that's driving this, but it's in Treasury and the Treasurer's interest to keep it going. That's immigration. Those housing prices, which might stop rates being cut, is being driven by especially this temporary immigration. The government's promised to crack down on it, but it helps your budget numbers. It helps you achieve your surplus. And it's propped up many a treasurer, not just a Labor treasurer, it has to be said. So that is a key thing that the government can control. You could argue they can't do cash splashes because that would drive up inflation, but they can do something about immigration. So that is one of the areas they need to be targeting. Now, what I've heard about this budget, OK, there could be a lift in rental assistance. There's probably an extension of energy bill relief, but there's no big ticket cost of living item in it, because otherwise they think it'll swamp the message of the tax cuts, which after all come into effect on July 1, Peter. So that's what they want to concentrate on. Plus this stuff they're going around talking about, Future Made in Australia, which involves a lot of government subsidies from what I can see without tender. I think that's a challenge for them.
Yeah,
they really need to be hoping for rate cuts at the end of the year, and they need to be, paying off debt, cutting spending, cutting immigration to make sure that happens. It's not going to be smooth sailing. It's a big test in the next 6 months. Jim Chalmers gets a lot of positive headlines. He's got some work to do, and so do his colleagues, Peter.
They clearly rolled the dice when they came in. They ramped up immigration to keep the underlying growth numbers high, so the broad GDP numbers. They didn't want to be a Labor government that got in there and had 2 quarters of negative growth and then they find themselves in a technical recession. So that's what they were doing. I can see the strategy. Of course, we've now had 4 quarters of negative growth in per capita terms, so per head of population, which is why people feel worse off, even though there's anemic growth right across the economy. That's the decision they made. Now they've realised this immigration hit is hurting people trying to get into the housing markets, hurting renters, and people, I think, regardless of their political persuasion, Andrew, are quite cranky about it. You add in all the other messes with the detainees and the stuff, migration is now a dirty word for Labor. So I think that's where they'll try and pull it back. But, go back to the point I made about the recession risk. They do risk falling into recession if that growth really is as anemic as the economists would suggest it is. So this is the challenge. And then they've got this mess to clean up with these foreign detainees. We've got the Senate, bitching and moaning as the Senate often does, but this time it's not the usual suspects. I mean, these are 3 Labor senators out there today saying that they have got concerns about the legislation. That's concerning in itself for Labor, because Labor doesn't normally air its dirty laundry in public like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's a few comments in a committee report. We're yet to see a breakout in caucus yet, Peter. I saw plenty of breakouts in the Liberal Party room over these sort of matters. I think it'd be a healthy thing for the government if their MPs weren't scared to death about speaking out about some of these things. I see it as kind of a positive, to be honest with you. I think that's the least of their concerns. The economic concerns and the detainee concerns I'd put higher up on the list, and they keep seeming to come up with what they see as a quick fix in terms of these bills they keep putting up. When you look at them, you think, how would that even practically work? Are you even going to implement that? Are you actually going to do mandatory minimum sentences for not much, except not wanting to go home? It's hard to see that actually implemented if they pass it. So it looks like an attempt to wedge the opposition and not being fair dinkum about solving the problem. So they've got issues on multiple fronts, but Peter Dutton is yet to convince. And so when I sort of, jocularly suggest he needs to kick with the wind in the last quarter, that's going to be his challenge. Because right now you've got some disaffected Labor voters going the minor parties, on the left to the Greens, on the right elsewhere. They're not necessarily going in vast numbers to the Liberal Party, and it's always hard to win after one term. It just doesn't happen in Australia. So that's the challenge for Dutton. I've always said it. I've always said his challenge is to get them into minority government and win after 6 years. He wouldn't like me for that because he thinks, I'll be in my late 50s by then, but that's the game we're in unless something astounding happens in the next year, Peter.
Yeah, but John Howard wasn't a winner until he won in a landslide. And Tony Abbott, I could start a bushfire with all the bits of paper written by journalists who said Tony Abbott was unelectable until he wins in a landslide. So we will leave that one to debate over the next 12 to 18 months. What about the issue of these two jets? I make the point before. I mean, who is running the show on this, I guess, administrative stuff going on that's, I think, really hurting them in a tabloid sense? There's countless examples. This is just the latest one. Why didn't someone pull them into line and say, look, if Bowen really needs to go, boss, let's make sure he's on our plane. We can stand down, John and Sarah and Jane. We'll take a skinnier crew from the PMO, but we can't have the look of taking two planes. That is, and I know the costs well, that's about $120,000 sitting there on the tarmac in terms of costs for taxpayers. I just think it's a shocking look.
It is a terrible look. I just think with these things, they act without fear, the government. And they can blame the RAAF. Like you say, you can take charge and say, look, we're going in one plane. I mean, no one would ever have known, except someone took a snap of it and put it on the Muswellbrook Facebook community page, and then it was picked up by Ben Fordham. So it just goes to show you, doesn't it? There's a whole bunch of stories out there. It just needs someone to highlight them. But this is just, this should put them on notice. You can't just be arrogant about these things and think you can get away with misusing VIPs. It's like you said at the top of the show. It's actually the little things that really trip you up, and not showing arrogance.
Yep.
Not showing arrogance. If you're going to talk about emissions, you've got to actually attend to that by not going on so many flights, because that involves emissions. Otherwise, you become pretty vulnerable, and it builds into a narrative of an arrogant government, and Australians don't like that, Peter.
Well, I think now every journalist is going to look at those VIP flight records very closely. Andrew Clennell, thank you. All right, after the break, yet another infrastructure project costing billions. It looks like it might go belly up. This is Inland Rail. It's actually a really worthwhile project, but it's been woefully managed to date. Barnaby Joyce set it up, so he's here after the break to explain to us what's gone so horribly wrong. Plus, the figures are in, that money from the big corporates for the Yes campaign. More on that too. Plus, those transgender hate speech laws in Scotland that could criminalise anyone speaking out to defend women. The wonderful Joyce, Helen Joyce, coming up. Welcome back. Shortly we'll cross to the UK, where new laws have just come into effect ostensibly to tackle hate crimes, but as my next guest will explain, these are much more about restricting free speech than tackling hate. But first to another infrastructure project that's not only behind schedule, but is looking like it might never be completed. Australia's Inland Rail project, which in principle is very worthwhile to get a new freight line to connect Victoria and Queensland. Well, it's being held up by political infighting, poor management and, as always, environmental approvals. Originally slated to be completed by 2027 at a cost of just over $9 billion, it's now blown out to beyond $31 billion, and no guarantees it'll ever actually cross the line from New South Wales into Queensland. Joining me now is the man who basically created this project when in government, but of course now they're in opposition, Shadow Veterans Minister Barnaby Joyce. Barnaby, I know how passionate you have been most of your political life in the Senate, then obviously in the lower house about the Inland Rail. What on earth has gone wrong? Because as I explained to people, it is such a good project, at least in its inception.
Dead right, Peter. Right back to the time I was in the Senate, I remember talking to an infrastructure minister when the Labor government was in. His name was Anthony Albanese, and explaining to him how important this was. And he said, well, you know, maybe after 2018 we'd look at it. Bill Shorten said it was a good idea. But when we had the coalition agreement with Malcolm Turnbull, Malcolm wanted the Western Sydney Airport, and I said, well, if you get Western Sydney Airport for a coalition agreement, I want the Inland Rail for regional people. Now, this is great for Melbourne, great for Brisbane, but it also grows towns such as Narrabri, Parkes, Goondiwindi. It becomes a corridor of commerce, an impetus to further growth, a reason for people to move their warehouses, their factories out into regional areas and give other people a reason to move into regional areas rather than just stack themselves one on top of the other in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. But what we've got from the Labor Party is this flying incompetence. It always starts with a review where they mimic me from Austin Powers and say, this is going to cost $31 billion. Well, prove it. How'd you come up with that number? Where'd that number fall out of the tree from? But what we have now, Peter, we have an inland rail that goes from, wait for it, Melbourne to Parkes, and a little bit up to Narromine, and then we have another one that goes from Newcastle to, here's a quiz, where is it? North Star. Heard of North Star? Well, it goes to a village called North Star. Now, it's supposed to go over there, to Brisbane. That's where it's supposed to go. But I don't know what's at North Star. I mean, maybe they're going to put a canal in there and we can unload boats there, or maybe there's a massive gold mine that's going to happen in North Star. But I've got an inkling that it's going to be sort of barley, canola, wheat, a little bit of cotton up the road. But that's not where it's supposed to go. And now we have this sort of idiocy of two halves of a ship, and they're going to try and float them both without sticking them together. It's just incredible. To make it work, we need to go from Narromine across to Narrabri. That is through the Pilliga scrub, right? Not through the Daintree, not across, you know, some sort of pristine rainforest, through the Pilliga scrub. But, you know, it's the environmental issues, it's this, it's that, it's something else. What it really is, the Labor Party.
Yeah, but the problem is, Barnaby, I'll just jump in here. The problem is, yet again, I mean, a lot of our wealth comes out of regional Australia, but regional Australia gets done over. City people drive on country roads. People in our capital cities should care about getting all those big road trains off our country regional highways onto these freight lines. It's good for commerce. On every level, you mentioned the towns there, on every level it's a good project. You know, we've got a federal government now obsessed about a space division in defence. Why are we even talking about going into space in Australia when we can't even build a bloody rail line?
They want to go into space, but they can't go out to Narrabri. It's just, that's the Labor Party. And you look at it, if you go through your history, the development of Texas, which has got an economy vastly bigger than Australia's, they said, people used to think it was oil, but if you go into the history, it was actually the railway lines that became the impetus for the further economic growth. Same thing in China. What we have here is trains that will be about 3.2 kilometres long, ultimately, going at about 110 kilometres an hour, double stacked. Now, each one of those stacks, each one of those containers is a truck off the road. And each one of those is a reason for the further economic growth. And, you know, this is what we've got to do. And I say to your listeners, look at your shirt. Your shirts come from overseas. Your ties come from overseas. Your phones come from overseas. Your television's from overseas. Somebody somewhere must be putting something on a boat and sending it in the other direction for those goods to come in. And they are in regional Australia. That's your coal miners, your gas, your cotton, your cattle, your grain. They're the products that people overseas want to buy off us. They don't buy your bank. They don't buy banks. They don't buy accountants. They don't buy solicitors. They buy cotton, coal, beef, iron ore, gold, wool, mutton. They're the things. And you need an inland rail to move these things to a port so you can be wealthy.
Hey, just quickly, these Yes donations come out today, the details out. About $50 million spent by woke corporates and others on the Yes campaign, about $15 million on the No. But the Yes got a walloping. Does this show how out of touch corporate boardrooms are?
Absolutely, and also peak bodies. I mean, I hope Brad Benucci, whatever his name is, why didn't you reach into your own pocket for that money? They see, you can always be such a big man at the sale yards with somebody else's chequebook, but all these people put in their shareholders' money. And the super funds, did you go and talk to your super funds about, we're going to donate to the Yescos? But, oh no, they're so virtuous with someone else's chequebook.
Oh, just on that, the car dealers, I know you're fired up about the cost of electric vehicles hitting SUVs and utes, which are, big issues for regional people. But the car dealerships were out today saying it'll be about $1 billion in these EV costs, and they are saying we're going to have to pass this on to consumers. Again, this is the cost that the government hasn't factored in for ordinary people, is it?
Yeah, well, and this is why the polling's tanking. This is Peter Pan economics. Like, we're going to have EVs. If we went here, how am I going to get an EV ute up the hills with 500 litres of water on it for spraying blackberries? I mean, it's just this illogical thing. We're going to cover the place up with swindle factories, wind farms, swindle factories and solar factories and transmission lines, and chase this sort of Peter Pan economics while we have every major manufacturing, our aluminium, our plastics, basically you name it, refining, all running for the door because our energy prices are too high. We're absolutely driving this economy into the ground, and EVs is just another classic example of how completely and utterly distracted and disjointed they are from the realities that the people at the checkout and the people trying to pay their power bills are experiencing.
Spot on, Barnaby Joyce. I'll leave it there. Great to have your company as always. Thanks, Barney. Right, another thing too out today, some statistics. Listen to this one. 1 out of every 3 jobs created last year were jobs reliant on that NDIS cash cow. How's that as taxpayers? Right, after the break, we're going to cross live to Caroline Marcus on the latest out of the Bruce Lerman case, that urgent case, as I told you. Network 10 live tonight in Sydney. And new laws have come into effect in Scotland. Big ramifications for free speech and the ability of women to defend our right to single-sex spaces. He might have gone, but Daniel Andrews, the secrecy documents, what they don't want you to know about the COVID era. That's a big fight happening now. I'll take you through that as well. Welcome back. Even more secrecy, as I said before the break, from the Victorian Labor government, desperate to keep documents from the Andrews era secret. We'll get into that shortly. But first, a judge has sensationally reopened the Bruce Lerman defamation trial after 10 successfully argued new evidence must be admitted. Senior reporter Caroline Marcus is live at the federal court. Caroline, we had a judgment slated down for this week. I think it was Thursday, but that'll now, of course, be delayed, surely.
It has been delayed, Peter. I can tell you that. The judge has said he'll be unable to deliver his verdict on Thursday morning as planned. He will now have to delay it until at least next week in order to hear this fresh evidence. This is an extraordinary intervention that has come from Network 10. On Easter Sunday, they sought to have an urgent bid to hear this new evidence and reopen this trial, and that bid has succeeded today in the court. A short time ago, Justice Michael Lee said it was in the public interest to try to resolve this as quickly as possible, and he intends to call a new witness to the stand tomorrow afternoon in order to hear this new evidence. Now, what I can tell you, what we've heard in court this afternoon, is that this new evidence centres on a series of affidavits that have been signed by a former producer with Seven Spotlight program, Taylor Auerbach. Now, Mr. Auerbach has claimed via these affidavits that Bruce Lerman was the source of a number of pieces of material that the program relied upon in its exclusive interviews with him that ran last year. Now, this evidence in particular includes more than 2,300 pages of mostly private text messages between Brittany Higgins and her then boyfriend, Ben Dillaway, that 10's lawyers described as deeply personal. They also said the evidence includes some messages between Brittany Higgins and Peter Fitzsimons, who is Lisa Wilkinson, the other respondent in this matter, the 10 presenter, her husband, who was organising a book deal for Miss Higgins, as well as various other evidence of additional benefits that were paid or alleged to have been given to Mr. Lohman, including massages, which have been the subject of numerous headlines over the past week or so, and steaks and expensive dinners. Now, the lawyers for 10 have argued that this new evidence goes to Mr. Lohman's credibility in the trial. They also said that it represents an abusive process, that he had allegedly given this material to Seven in a way that was calculated to put pressure on witnesses and parties in this defamation trial. We also heard arguments from Lisa Wilkinson's lawyer, Sue Chrysanthu, who told the court that the evidence may also be relevant to how much damages Mr. Lohman is entitled to should Justice Lee find in his favour when he hands down the verdict, because any additional benefits he received, whether that be the accommodation Channel 7 paid for or these massages and steaks, may be relevant towards that. Now, in reply to all of this, Mr. Lohman's lawyers have tried to argue that the evidence should not be admitted. They said that it was at most trivial and that the judge had already made reference during the trial to the fact that both of the key witnesses, Mr. Lohman and Brittany Higgins, had been alleged to have told dozens of lies in this case. So the issue of credibility may not be so impacted in this. So ultimately, Peter, the judge has decided to grant leave to reopen this case. The judgment will not be handed down this Thursday. At earliest, it will be next week, and he will call a new witness to the stand tomorrow.
Thank you. And we know Justice Lee likes an open court, so when that testimony is aired tomorrow, we'll bring you all of that tomorrow night here on Credlin. Thank you very much, Caroline. I know you'll be back there in the courts tomorrow. Let's go now to those new alarming hate crime laws that have come into effect today in Scotland, which creates a new crime of stirring up hatred related to age, disability, religion, sexual orientation or transgender identity. Now, on the face of it, you might say pretty reasonable, because you and I know activists will bend the definition of hatred to be as broad as possible, punishing reasonable opinions with years of vexatious legal action. Joining me now, someone who has fought hard for the rights of women, Helen Joyce. Helen, thank you for your time. I love having you on the program. My audience just finds you so refreshing. These are huge laws. It's made the headlines here in Australia. And there was concern today, even from the author J.K. Rowling, basically daring, the authorities in Scotland to jail her because on the face of it, she says, every time I defend women, I am on the wrong side of your new laws.
That's right. So this law is very broadly drafted. It includes just being abusive. And you might think like, well, people shouldn't be abusive. But what does abusive mean? It doesn't have to mean threatening. And we know that trans lobby groups think it's abusive to call a man if that man identifies as a woman. And indeed, that is part of what they expect to try to catch. So that's the first problem, that it's so broadly drawn. And the second problem is that even if you are, in the end, found not guilty or not even charged, you can be dragged through a whole police process. And there's this whole big trans lobby that's encouraging people to report. You can report anonymously, you can report from outside Scotland, you can report in any one of hundreds of hate crime centres, which includes a sex shop and a mushroom farm. And, there's this idiotic campaign with a pop-up red furry monster called the Hate Monster that says, if you think you've seen something hateful, tell us about it. So the police are just going to be tied up. Going after people for just saying things like, well, men can't be women. This particular man isn't a woman, even though he says he is.
And we know, of course, that even if you are found to be innocent, if the allegations levelled against you, if you're a broadcaster or an author like you and I, you'll pull your comments in. You won't be able to touch that topic for the 2 or 3 years you run through the courts, even if you're vindicated. But if you're someone in a corporate job or out in the real world, you're just too scared. You will just not speak your mind, however reasonable your comments might be. They might not be hateful, they might be reasonable. But if you're litigated and you haven't got the money to defend yourself, you're in trouble.
Absolutely, and the police can take your phone or your computer as part of a process of seeing whether there's a pattern here. I think that somebody like me who doesn't have a job somewhere, that I will lose it if I speak the truth. I'm going to keep speaking the truth. But the reason that I do that is that I know that a lot of other people can't. So yes, I mean, people are already saying that they won't be able to get bookings for comedy shows, that they won't be able to get bookings on television, that sort of thing, but also just keeping quiet in the workplace. Because again, I actually don't approve of any of these hate speech laws. I regard them all as an intrusion on free speech, and I think they cause more harm than good. But the specific issue here is that they're saying that you cannot change sex is abusive. But you can't change sex, and you have to say that if you want to defend women's rights.
And the craziness thing, you've seen this in Scotland, we've seen it in other countries too, not so much in Australia, though there's a couple of cases in Victoria. You have men charged with rape. They front the court until the point that they're about to get convicted. They know they're going to go down. They then say, well, I identify as a woman. And the farcical system in Scotland not only accepts that they're a woman, it calls them a woman, they are intact biological men, allows them then to go into female prisons. I mean, if you were telling someone about this 10 or 15 years ago, they would say, what planet are you on? But this is the real world now for us, so particularly you in Scotland.
And this is why this sort of law was brought in, why it was agitated for by the trans lobby, because they're trying to snooker you. They're trying to make it impossible to say what's happening. So they put a man in a women's prison, or they have a man running the Rape Crisis Centre in Edinburgh, for example. He says he's a woman, but he's a man. And then they make it impossible for you to say that in clear language without getting tangled up with police investigations. So they're trying to make it just impossible to say what you are doing is an absolute gross intrusion on women's rights. Suddenly, somehow, we're the hateful people for saying that what they're doing is hateful. It's incredible. It's 1984.
What about that decision by the NHS in the UK to no longer prescribe puberty blockers for children? In Victoria, in Australia, they came out very quickly and said that will still, remain our medical advice. This will still be something, this gender affirmation policy, that we abide by in Australia, even though the UK is now one of a number of countries around the world changing their mind on how to deal with gender dysphoria and children.
Every healthcare system that has looked at the evidence properly and independently has found that there is no evidence supporting the use of puberty blockers in gender-distressed children, and increasing reason to worry about it. Worry about the long-term bone health of those children, worry about their mental development, and also it doesn't make them feel any better. So you really shouldn't be doing it, and I foresee that you won't be doing it in some years' time. But in the meantime, some children will have been irreversibly harmed. So anyone who has any influence in this system, you need to keep pushing, make them do an independent review of the evidence, and they will come to the same conclusion as everywhere else that has done one.
We're doing our best. Helen Joyce, thank you. Right after the break, we'll get on to a number of issues, particularly that Victorian secrecy stuff about COVID and Daniel Andrews. I don't suspect you're surprised, but wait till I give you the details. See you soon. Welcome back. Well, let's head to Victoria, where the state government's fighting to keep documents related to the COVID-19 hotel quarantine disaster a secret. Lawyers for the Premier, Jacinta Allen, are arguing the documents cannot be accessed via Freedom of Information requests because Dan Andrews has resigned. Joining me now to discuss this, Liberal MP David Davis. Well, I'll tell you what, if you get your hands on these documents, David Davis, A, you should be congratulated, but B, I want to have a quick look at the copy straight away because, hotel quarantine is still scar tissue, I think, for Melburnians, for Victorians in particular. Why can't we have a look at these documents? You've put the request in. Why can't we see them?
Peter, you're absolutely right. We all remember that period. The hotel quarantine was concocted almost certainly in the then Premier's office or very close to it. And then by July, the bug is leaking out right across the state. Hundreds of people died. Terrible impact on Victorians, terrible impact on the economy. Then there's the Coate inquiry, Jennifer Coate, and she couldn't come to any conclusion. There was something in the water, I think. There was a loss of
no one had any memory.
Understanding. No one had any memory. There was something very strange going on. But we put in an FOI request in January of 2021, and we've been fighting that ever since. The government under Daniel Andrews had finally agreed to give across the material back in the middle of the year after a series of court proceedings. So we'd sort of fought them to the point where they're going to release it. But then they sort of just went very quiet and slowed, and we couldn't get responses. And then bang, he's gone. That day I wrote to the Information Commissioner and said, I'm very worried that they're going to destroy documents. To the Acting Information Commissioner's credit, she wrote to departments and agencies, including the Office of the Premier, which is now obviously headed by Jacinta Allen, the new Premier. But they don't want to release the documents. There was a hearing the other day. There's another one next week, a closed hearing. And we still don't have clarity on whether the documents will be released or indeed where they are. They don't seem to know
David,
where they are.
let me just jump in there.
They don't.
Let me jump in there. I mean, is there argument that these documents aren't the property of the Labor government, that they are the property of the individual Premier, and if not released by that Premier, they can't be or won't be released?
There's certainly, I think, public documents in the sense these particular documents are subject to an FOI request, and in that sense, they're not things that can be casually discarded. And they do belong to the Office of the Premier, but the Office of the Premier actually has a new head now, and that Office of the Premier has actually got responsibilities not to destroy or damage documents, but to make them available as per a court or a lawful process. So they've got to provide these documents. I mean, this secrecy under this government has got completely and utterly out of control. And the fights that we're seeing now, the long fights, they're using every legal trick in the book to try and block the release of embarrassing, damaging documents that they don't want the public to see. I think where more than 800 people have died, hundreds of thousands, millions of people impacted, that Victorians are entitled to see the truth. They're entitled, they have a right
we paid for it,
to see
David.
the truth, and that's why we're fighting.
And there's literally
we paid for it.
Tens of millions of dollars here being spent, and I remember obviously all the ins and outs and the memory loss at the Coate inquiry. But earlier than that, we were finding out information only by piecing together text messages and catching the Premier out and what he said in one press conference to the other. Coate never got most of the documents that you and I know exist inside governments. What happens now? I mean, is this going to go to court? Are you going to push it as far as you can go?
Well, you understand because you were there on some of those press conferences that went on endlessly day after day. But Coate didn't get to the bottom of what's gone on. That's why we want these documents. There are a very narrow band of documents, texts, emails, Slack messages inside the Premier's office between him and his former Chief of Staff, Lissy Ratcliffe, and others. And those documents, we believe, go very close to who made these decisions about hotel quarantine. So in one sense, given the behaviour of the government across the whole of the Labor government, it's not surprising that they're fighting and fighting and fighting to stop the release of these documents. But it is wrong. It is wrong. They should be in the public domain. People have a right to know. Too many people died.
Well, too many people, close to 1,000, well, over 1,000 people died in Victoria. But as I said, hundreds of millions of dollars. Just before we go, I mean, he's set up a company, Daniel Andrews, a couple of companies. He hasn't popped up yet. He's getting $300,000 for the rest of his life from Victorian taxpayers. There's talk he might do business in China. There's talk he might get some government appointments. We're almost out of time. What do you think's next for Daniel Andrews?
Well, he'll suit himself. It'll all be about him. It won't be about the people of Victoria. It should be about the people of Victoria, and he could start by releasing these documents now. He could release them tomorrow. They could come out, and he could make sure that the current Premier, who is now the head of the office, the Premier, releases the documents Victorians are entitled to see.
Spot on, David Davis. I'll leave it there. Of course, there's the challenge for Daniel Andrews tonight. I know he watches Credlin all the time. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you tomorrow night at 6. Here's Andrew Bolt.